So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Beckie Child. I've been doing mental health advocacy in Multnomah County at the state level and at the federal level since the mid-90s. And it came because of my own experiences in the mental health system. And I always tell people I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. And there's still a lot of good, bad, and ugly there. One of the things that I really got into before I started graduate school was I was reading biographies or autobiographies of people diagnosed with mental illness. And I happened to come across Elyn's biography, The Center Cannot Hold. And I found it to be compelling reading and kind of turned some things that I had been thinking a little bit upside down in my head as I was thinking about her experiences and the support that she's had throughout her life. Not that she didn't have a hard life, but she's had incredible support. And I often have wondered what would happen if all the people we know, the people who are still in institutions, had the support like that, what that would be. Because one of the things that mental illness does is it takes things from people. We look at people as though they're liabilities, and we don't get to see the gifts that they bring us. And little did I know that my advocacy journey would let me meet Elyn one day, a few years later. One of the things that she's done since she's been at the, I'm going to misspeak here, at USC's Gold School of Law, Sachs Institute on Mental Health Policy, Law, and Ethics. Say that fast 3 times, people. Is that they've started tackling the complex and complicated issues that surround mental health challenges. They've held forums on the criminalization of mental illness, the use of mechanical restraints, the complex issues associated with psychotropic medication, navigating the Byzantine mental health system, supporting students in higher education who experience serious mental health challenges, stigma and discrimination in the media, and the intersection of the use of force with race, gender, disability, and serious mental illness. She's currently working on developing a standard on supported decision-making for people with developmental or intellectual disabilities and who have capacity issues in terms of making decisions in their life. I remember the conference where I met Elyn. It was a remarkable conference. It was on supporting students in higher education. It impacted my life in 2 different ways. One, as a student in higher ed myself, and also because I also teach in higher ed, that I have found ways to support students who are struggling. And it's amazing the number of students who struggle even when going to school, who aren't, quote unquote, formally out about their status as having mental health challenges. There's things that higher education can do to support students like that, and I hope that that work will continue at some point. Elyn, I'd love to work with you more on that. She is a kindred spirit whose commitment to social justice seeks to ensure that people, including the most ill, are treated with dignity and respect. She wants everyone to have access to the least restrictive and most supportive options that stand up in a court of law in favor of the person having freedoms over other involuntary protective measures. And just welcome to Portland, Elyn.
Thank you so much, Beckie, for that kind introduction. I am honored and delighted to be speaking at the Oregon Law and Mental Health Conference. It's a special day for me for many reasons. I have a chance to work with Beckie Child, one of the conference organizers who was just up here. Beckie has been a great friend to the Sachs Institute. She has participated in our programming at the University of Southern California, and I was thrilled to have a chance to see the terrific work Beckie is doing in Oregon. She's a really special person. Second, I've gotten to know Jason Renaud. Jason, together with the two other conference organizers, Beckie and Juliet Burton, has put together an outstanding program. When I went to your website, the first thing I read was the purpose of your conference, to, quote, connect the conversation of law, legislation, and regulation with mental health, including clinical services, support, housing, friends, and families. I hope you won't consider me presumptuous to say that this language could easily describe the purpose of my professional life. It touched me to read your words, and they have made me feel at home today. The programming I have attended this morning was also really terrific and inspiring. I don't have time to review the excellent speakers and panels you've put together, but please let me thank each and every one of you for the work you're doing. I want to give a special thank you and shout out to those speakers with lived experience for your courage and tenacity. Keep up the good fight, or as we say at USC, fight on. The title of my talk today is Schizophrenia and I, Making Peace with Mental Illness. My title is an attempt to convey that schizophrenia is a relational illness. By relational, I mean that it involves personal identity, that it profoundly implicates one's social world, and that it has political meanings as well. I think these three aspects of schizophrenia, the identity, the social, and the political, resonate deeply with today's conference programming. I'll be using excerpts from my memoir, The Center Cannot Hold, to illustrate my point. I first became seriously ill studying ancient philosophy at Oxford as a Marshall Scholar. At first, it seemed like I had depression with mild paranoid features, which, as you know, is how schizophrenia often first begins. But then the illness evolved into a pure thought disorder. Despite much resistance, I eventually found my way to a psychiatric hospital with strong encouragement from the doctors at the university who I had seen at the urging of a friend. I had graduated as class valedictorian at Vanderbilt, had been accepted as a Marshall Scholar at Oxford, but I was in terrible shape. I spent much of my time wandering the streets of Oxford, mumbling to myself and gesticulating, and contemplating the various ways to commit suicide, to rid the world of my evil. I had absolutely no insight into the severity of my condition. I had no awareness there might be a gap between how I saw myself and how others saw me. I entered the hospital voluntarily. After about a week or two, everything changed. It wasn't something that a doctor or a fellow patient or a friend had said. It was a simple look into a mirror. I saw myself reading from the text. It was the first time I'd actually seen myself in weeks, and it felt as if someone had punched me in the stomach. Good God, I thought, who is that? I was emaciated and hunched over like someone 3 or 4 times my age. My face was gaunt, my eyes simultaneously vacant and full of terror. My hair was wild and filthy, my clothes wrinkled and stained. It was the visage of a crazy person on the long-forgotten ward of a hospital for lunatics, ending the passage. The gap between whom I imagined myself to be and whom I saw in the mirror that day was profound and unavoidable. Far from making my peace with my mental illness, until that moment, I did not truly believe I had a mental illness to make peace with. That moment, that look in the mirror, was the beginning of a journey that would last a quarter of a century. In retrospect, it's no accident that the song I chose to listen to over and over in the psych ward after that experience was the Beatles. Once there was a way to get back homeward, once there was a way to get back home. I needed to find my way home. Now, I think Freud was a brilliant thinker, and he got many things right. What I don't think Freud got right is his view that intense talk therapy is not appropriate for people who are psychotic. According to Freud, analysis was not appropriate for psychotic patients because an individual who was actively psychotic could not form a transference to the analyst. Freud's view is absolutely not consistent with my experience. In my experience, the need to be in a relationship, to be part of a social world, may be most profound precisely when someone is psychotic. I began my first work with a psychoanalyst at Oxford, and it was difficult, painful work. What I noticed from my first experience with intensive talk therapy was two things. First, my analyst was hugely helpful in diffusing a sense of shame that went along with the thoughts I was having. My thoughts were violent and deeply disturbing about myself and other people. My analyst, Mrs. Jones, was able to tolerate everything. It's difficult for me adequately to convey how helpful it was to me to have someone listen, not judge me, and not threaten to put me in the hospital or call the police, as might have happened in the United States. Second, I noticed that as I felt more related to my analyst, Mrs. Jones, I began to make friends again and be able to work again. I realized that someone could object by questioning the direction of the causal arrows here. Fair enough. My point is, as I became able to share my internal experience, my ability to interact with the world around me got better. I want to note and emphasize that the most helpful consultant I had in England said two things. First, I needed to be in intensive talk therapy. And second, I should be back in school as a way to exercise my mind. The hospital doctors were all suggesting that I withdraw from school and go back to the States. The consultant was right, and I will be forever grateful to him. I finished my degree at Oxford and came back to the States to study law at Yale. My transition was rocky. For someone not familiar with a psychotic illness, it's difficult to understand that at that point, I didn't really believe I had a mental illness. My thought was that I was somehow different from other people, and not in a good way, but that through the exercise of willpower, I could tame whatever was wrong. Quite literally, like one has a wild horse in a corral that one needs to tame. The challenge, as I framed it at that point in my life, was to take that woman whom I'd seen in that mirror and tame her and groom her, or maybe just make sure she always stayed at home when I went out. So I began Yale Law School. I was not in treatment, nor was I on medication. As a parenthetical note, Mrs. Jones in England had never suggested that I considered medication, even though I was psychotic at Oxford most of the time. Within several weeks after law school began, I became overwhelmed. One night, in the library at the roof of the Yale Law School, I became quite psychotic, and the following day, I ended up being taken to the hospital by one of my professors, whose assignment had sent me over the edge. At the hospital, I found myself in a small private room waiting for a doctor. The attendant was kind. He was a really big guy, so a little scary. And I readily gave him my telephone wire belt, which I had proudly made the evening before, when I'd been floridly psychotic on the roof of the Yale Law School, and not satisfied with my denim jeans, blue jeans, and bland t-shirt, I decided to accessorize. I had also picked up a nail that I kept in my pocket. Many people who are psychotic carry things which can be used as weapons, not because they want to hurt someone, but because they are afraid that someone might want to hurt them. This visit to the emergency room resulted in my first hospitalization in America, reading from the text. You can have my telephone wire belt, but you can't have my 6-inch nail, I said, patting my pocket. Then someone whom I'll call just the doctor arrived. Give that to me, he ordered. No, I said. The doctor immediately called for security. Another attendant came in, this one not so nice. Once he'd pried the nail from my fingers, I knew I was done for. Within seconds, the doctor and his whole team of goons swooped down, grabbed me, lifted me out of the chair, and slammed me down on a nearby bed with such force that I saw stars. Then they bound both my legs and arms to the metal bed with thick leather straps. A sound came out of my mouth that I'd never heard before. Half groan, half scream, barely human, and full of terror. Then the sound came again, forced from somewhere deep inside my belly and scraping my throat raw. No, I shouted, stop this, don't do this to me. I glanced up to see a face watching the entire scene through the window in the steel door. Why was she watching me? Who was she? I was an exhibit, a specimen, a bug impaled on a pin and helpless to escape. Please, I begged, please. This is like something from the Middle Ages. Please, don't do this to me. Ending the passage. Shame is a pervasive experience of people with psychosis. Often we are ashamed of what we are thinking, and so we hide our thoughts from other people. This shame may play itself out in many ways. After my experience in the emergency room, 5 months of hospitalization ensued. Hospitalization involving long-term restraints and seclusion. The first 3 weeks I was probably restrained anywhere between 3 to 18 hours a day. Read my chart after the fact, it said, quote, use restraints liberally. I was also at times forcibly medication, and I was given little privacy. In the beginning, I was even watched when I went to the bathroom and took a shower, and I was not allowed to have any conversations outside the presence of staff, including with my parents. I believe that the hands-off approach of the Oxford Hospital, which one might even call benign neglect, was preferable to the over-interventionist approach, often driven by risk management concerns, of the American hospital. As I have come to say, I am very pro-psychiatry, but very anti-force. After 2 weeks on an emergency commitment, I was faced with the question of whether I would try to get out of the hospital. Parenthetically, the doctors put me on an emergency commitment because they said I was, quote, dangerous to myself and others, and, quote, gravely disabled. And the reason they gave for the latter was that I couldn't do my Yale Law School homework, which made me wonder about many of the other people in New Haven. I could contest the hospital's motion to civilly commit me. To me, the choice seemed clear. I would demand a hearing to fight the commitment. I brought this up to my father, who is an attorney. My father was equally clear. Do not contest this, because if you lose, you now have been civilly committed, and you're going to have to report your commitment every time you apply for a license to practice law. He said to me, you certainly don't want anything in your record where a judge orders you to stay in the hospital. When I speak about the political dimensions of schizophrenia, I speak not only about the social stigma, which is real and pervasive. I also speak about these life events that can follow an individual with schizophrenia for decades. There are profound political aspects to the illness and can become huge burdens that people with schizophrenia carry, and it's important that people in their lives are aware of them. Jason, Juliet, and Beckie, your conference is spot on in addressing these issues. There's actually a funny story about my readmission to the Yale Law School. So Yale had a policy that if you were withdrawn from school for psychiatric reasons, you had to be evaluated by the head of university health to see if you were ready to return. And like any good student, I looked this guy up, and before the age of the internet, so I'm pulling books from shelves and looking at periodical indices, and I find an article which was basically students withdrawn from school for psychiatric reasons, evaluating them for readmission, questions you want to ask and answers you want to hear. So I was really totally prepared for the interview. Anyway, we've discussed personal identity aspects of the illness, we've talked some about the social aspects of the illness, and we've touched upon the political aspects. I want to push these ideas further by talking about the centrality of relationship to healing. Healing does not occur in isolation. It's painful to me when I speak with friends who are mental health professionals working in community mental health centers who manage their caseloads in the hundreds. Healing begins in relationships, and in all kinds of ways, a patient's relationship with a mental health professional is an integral part of the healing. I worry tremendously that this point has been lost on our policymakers, and of course other relationships are healing as well. After I was hospitalized upon returning to the US, I took the rest of that year off, what would have been my first year at Yale Law School, and then I returned the following fall to begin again. It was when I began Yale Law School a second time that I made my closest friend in a man named Steve Benke. Steve, raise your hand. He's here with me today. Steve is an attorney and a clinical psychologist with an appointment in clinical ethics at Harvard's Department of Psychiatry. Reading from the text. One of the worst aspects of schizophrenia is the profound isolation, the constant awareness that you're different, some sort of alien, not really human. Other people have flesh and bones and insides made of organs and healthy living tissue. You are only a machine with insides made of metal. Medication and talk therapy allay this terrible feeling, but friendship can be as powerful as either. Steve Benke and I were in contracts class together, and a couple of times he'd asked me for an assignment. Other than that, we had never really spoken. One night we were at dinner in the cafeteria with a group of people. The dinner conversation that night in the law school dining room was casual and pleasant, drifting from one subject to another, classes and law journal and summer jobs. I noticed that Steve seemed engaged enough. He nodded, he smiled, but after a while it began to look like simple politeness. As our classmates got up to leave the table, I realized I wasn't ready to go just yet. And there began one of those conversations that lasts a lifetime, one in which there is immediate comfort and acceptance, the equivalent of someone's strong hand offered to you when you most need to grasp it. That first talk flew far and wide. How we got to Yale, who our families were, then philosophy and religion, and what mattered to us and why. Steve had majored in classics at Princeton, where he was named salutatorian of his class and spoke in Latin at graduation. The summer after graduation, he worked as a janitor at a small-town airport, and then he went to Rome, where he lived with a group of Benedictine monks and read Latin at the Vatican with a pope who served as the Pope's Latinist. He considered entering the monastery and studying medieval philosophy, but decided against it because medieval philosophy had ceased to hold his interest, at least as a lifelong endeavor. Instead of becoming a monk, Steve came to Yale Law School, and so did I, and neither of us was quite sure why. Sometime later, it occurred to me that at the very moment I was being tied to a bed in a psychiatric ward, screaming bloody murder and afraid for my life, Steve was singing Gregorian chant in a monastery overlooking the ancient city of Rome. And here we were now, come to the same place from two very different directions. It was past midnight when we said goodnight, and as I walked back to my room, I had the distinct feeling, in the middle of my usual muddle, that I'd been unexpectedly blessed. I don't know why I decided to tell Steve the truth about myself. I don't know why I thought I could trust him, but I did. I believed from our very first conversation that this man would be a significant friend and a force for good in my life. Once the possibility came to my mind, I realized how much I wanted it to be so. But I didn't believe that that could happen unless I revealed the truth about myself and let him see me in full. So much of what I did on a daily basis was about faking it. I knew I would never fake it with him. And so, on a rainy afternoon at a pizzeria in New Haven, I shared my history. Aside from doctors and therapists, it was the first time I'd ever done this with anyone, anywhere. Ending the passage. After Steve had graduated from law school and left New Haven, my then analyst, Dr. White, announced that he was going to close his practice in 3 months, fully 2 years before I had planned to leave. The news of White leaving shattered me. Again, when I return to what I see as Freud's mistaken view that psychotic patients don't form transferences with their analysts. In fact, my transferences were quite powerful, and at the end of my first 2 analytic relationships could have easily landed me in the hospital. Fortunately, neither did. When White gave me the news of his planned early retirement, Steve was traveling around the country, interviewing for PhD programs in clinical psychology. He had sensed that something was terribly wrong, and he came to New Haven to see me, reading from the text. I opened the door of my studio apartment. Steve would later tell me that for all the times he'd seen me psychotic, what he saw that day shocked him. For a week or more, I had barely eaten. I was gaunt and moved as though my legs were wooden. My face looked and felt like a mask. Since I pulled down all the shades, the apartment, in the middle of the afternoon, was in near total darkness. The air was fetid, the place was a shambles. Steve has worked with many patients who suffer from severe mental illness, and to this day, he'll tell me that on that afternoon, I looked as bad as any he had ever seen. Hi, I said, then returned to the couch, where I was silent for about 5 minutes. Thank you for coming, Steve, I finally said. Crumbling world, word, voice, tell the clocks to stop. Time has come. White is leaving, Steve said somberly. I'm being pushed into a grave. The situation is grave, I moaned. Gravity is pulling me down. Tell them to get away. I'm scared. Ending the passage. Healing takes place in many forms and in many venues. I could not have survived this illness without close friends, family, and colleagues who have known me over the course of my illness and have been there to help me. Healing takes place in relationship. As wonderful as Steve was and is, he was a friend, like a brother. Around the time I received tenure, or shortly after, I ran into a man named Will, a man I thought was handsome, friendly, and smart, a man with whom I tried to flirt a few times when I was working toward tenure, and he was working at the law library at USC. I want to mention also that when I dated normally in high school and college, but when I went ill, I stopped. That sort of part of my life went by the wayside, and I basically went 18 years without dating, quoting from the text. When it came to my personal life after my illness had quieted down somewhat, I started nurturing a fragile but growing hope for a relationship with a man named Will, again, a librarian at USC and an artist. I tried flirting to him with no avail, but after he left USC, he invited me to lunch. And then he invited me to see the California Poppy Reserve in Lancaster, not far from Los Angeles. I kept suggesting that I was really, really cold, hoping that he would put his arm around me. But he never did. But when we got back to my house, my apartment, he kissed me a long, lingering kiss goodnight. And the thought I had, and this is literally the thought that went through my mind, is, this is even better than getting an article accepted. I know that's kind of sad. The next day, after lunch and before the poppies, Will brought me a feather from his parrot, whom he had lovingly described at lunch, and he pasted it on my computer. And that evening, and I'm not sure why I put it this way, because I don't think I thought it happened this way, but I asked my Vanderbilt friend Kenny, do you think a guy who plucks a feather from his bird and pastes it on your computer likes you? And Kenny said, I don't know, but one thing for sure, he likes you better than he likes his bird. But actually, at that moment, that wasn't true. He definitely liked his bird better. Back to the text. I wanted a relationship with Will, and slowly I began to believe that it actually might happen. Eventually, I told Will that I loved him, and indeed, that he was the first man I had ever loved in that way. He said that made him very sad. At the right moment, I told him about my illness, and he responded as gently and kindly as a person could. If Steve's friendship had made me feel human, Will was making me feel like a woman. Ending the passage. When I say my relationship with Steve made me feel human, don't take that metaphorically. I did not feel like a human. I felt my insides were made of metal, and that things that happened to other people, the feelings that they had, weren't part of my life. I believed I was something else, a different kind of being. But it was with these two relationships, with Steve and with Will, which brought me not simply to think, but to feel that I am human and I am capable of loving relationships. Today, Steve and Will are my closest friends, and I think of them as my two pillars. But there was a point where I thought I had lost Steve. I suffered from an episode of Capgras syndrome, in which you believe that a person has been taken over by something or something else. That person is no longer really that person. This episode happened to me in the mid-90s when I was in a struggle with my analyst, Dr. Kaplan, about how much medication I should be on. We had reached a compromise which I was not entirely happy with, but with which I had agreed. Here's a rather lengthy passage from the text that describes this episode, quoting from the text. Soon after getting back on a higher dose of Zyprexa, I went to San Francisco, where I was scheduled to present 2 papers at a week-long conference on dissociative disorders. Evidently, the Zyprexa withdrawal had been rougher on my system than I knew, leaving me vulnerable and even a little frail. I began to feel off soon after I arrived at my hotel. Once again, I gritted my teeth and narrowed my focus to work and my obligations at the conference, hoping no one would suspect anything was wrong. But the delusions and disorganization accelerated. I was coming apart at the seams. I called Kaplan. If you can, why don't you deliver your Saturday paper as scheduled, he said, and then come back here, then fly back up early Wednesday morning to deliver that one. On some level, his suggestion made sense. I was never very good in unfamiliar territory, but perhaps I could regain control once back in LA, in my own apartment or in the haven of my office. But as I mulled over Kaplan's suggestion, I decided that having to leave the conference would signal that I was a failure. Of the 2 scenarios, being sick versus being a failure, I could more easily accept the first one, so I decided to stay. At which point my sickness took a new, horrific turn. For some reason, I decided that Kaplan and Steve were imposters. They looked the same, they sounded the same, they were identical in every way to the originals, but they'd been replaced by someone or something. Was it the work of alien beings? I had no way of knowing, but I was terrified. Much later, I learned that what I was experiencing was called Capgras syndrome. The scientific literature about Capgras likens the sensation it produces to the cult film Invasion of the Body Snatchers. In my mind, the people I so depended on were simply gone, and the two who remained were not who they said they were. Therefore, I could not trust either of them. It was a struggle, but I delivered my Wednesday paper and fled back to Los Angeles, shaking and completely paranoid. In nearly 10 years of treatment, I had never missed an appointment with Kaplan. Now I didn't go to my next 2 scheduled sessions and didn't call him to tell him why. So he called me. Elyn, you're not at your appointments. What's going on? I did not respond. It's not him. Don't say a word. It's not him. Elyn, that's happening? Nothing. I think it's important for you to come to your sessions, he said. I expect you to be here tomorrow. Is there something I can do? I know what's going on and who you are or not, I said finally. That doesn't get us anywhere, he said. Talk to me straight. Nothing. No answer. Because you are not you. Okay, then I'll see you tomorrow, and then he hung up. I did not attend our next session. Steve, sensing that something was terribly wrong, was calling frequently. I didn't return any of his phone calls. Will, of course, recognized that I was very agitated, but he didn't know why. What's going on, he asked. The two who call themselves Kaplan and Steve are imposters, I said. The real ones are gone, and they've been replaced. The ones who are leaving messages on the answering machine are fake. To his everlasting credit, Will stayed calm. I warned him that something like this might happen, and now it had. Maybe I should call Steve, he said. I don't see the point, because Steve's not there anymore, I said, but go ahead if it will make you feel better. He thought it over for a while, then called Steve in the middle of the night. Steve awoke early to find the message on his machine and called back. As best he could, Will explained what was going on. Steve began to call and leave messages for me on the machine, 10, sometimes 12 times a day. I ignored them because he wasn't Steve, and I got angry because he was treating me like a recalcitrant child. In analysis, there's a term for this, infantilizing. How dare he, I thought, looking at the answering machine, as though it had been manipulated by aliens as well. But of course, he was in an impossible situation. I was frightened and isolated. Even though I somehow knew that Will was the real Will, I found no comfort in that. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't work, and I couldn't make the connection between what was real and what wasn't real. The next day, after my third missed appointment with him, Kaplan called and insisted I go up in my Zyprexa. Although I knew in my soul that he wasn't really Kaplan, I paid attention to him because I was just that desperate and miserable, and over the next several days, the delusion slowly passed. If I was still harboring any hope that I could somehow be free of the need to take antipsychotic medication, losing both Kaplan and Steve to my psychosis convinced me utterly, ending the passage. The only way to understand why the Capgras episode was so disturbing to me is to understand that these relationships were a tether to my own humanness. If I lost these ties to my humanness, I might really no longer be human. I am not speaking in metaphor here. I quite literally thought that I might no longer be human if I lost them. I've been talking here about myself and relationship. I would like to return to say a few more words about my relationship with my mental illness and how I conceptualize that relationship. When I moved to Los Angeles from New Haven, my analyst and I developed a way of talking, a sort of heuristic about my illness and my relationship to my illness. There were, in our manner of speaking, 3 me's: Elyn, Professor Sachs, and the lady at the charts. I could not imagine integrate these 3 aspects of myself. How could I be a thinker of big thoughts, an academic, if my mind were so damaged? How could I be both Professor Sachs and the lady of the medical charts? And where did Elyn fit in all this? What took a huge amount of effort, and what was ultimately self-defeating, was to keep them separate. I wasn't sure who was the real me. This confusion expressed itself in an intense ambivalence toward taking my medication. For many years, my motto was, the less medicine, the less effective. Steve was a virtual saint. He spent literally years of our relationship going through time and time again when I tried to get off my medication with disastrous results. It wasn't simply I didn't like the side effects of my medication. The need to take the medication reached to the core of my identity. If I could get by without medication, maybe I wasn't really mentally ill and the lady at the charts would disappear. Only Elyn and the professor would be left as a real me. This cycle culminated in one final effort to get off my meds several years after I'd been on the faculty of USC. Reading from the text. While White had supported me many times in my efforts to get off medication, which I undertook with great gusto and failed miserably at each time, one battle between Kaplan and me concerned the use of medication. Early on, we really locked horns over this. Kaplan thought I should just stay on the meds and get on with my life. For me, as I said, my motto was the less medicine, the less effective. Part of the way I could prove I wasn't mentally ill, which I resisted mightily for many years, was to get off medication and do well. And so I kept trying and trying and trying. I decided to make one last effort to get off. I thought I never really tried hard enough. I put a lot of extra supports in place to help keep me true to my goal. And so I started the reduction. I hid what I was feeling when I started feeling bad. The days and nights were harder now. The sheer physical effort of containing my body and my thoughts felt like trying to hold back a team of wild horses. Sleep was spotty and filled with dreams that left me awake and sweating in terror. Nevertheless, I dropped down again. Months before, I accepted an invitation to present at a workshop at Oxford. By the time I boarded the plane for home, I was a complete wreck. When I walked into Kaplan's office my first day back, I headed straight for the corner, crouched down on the floor, and began to shake. All around me were thoughts of evil beings poised with daggers. They'd slice me up in thin slices or make me swallow hot coals. Kaplan would later describe me as, quote, writhing in agony. Even in this state, what he accurately described as, quote, acutely and floridly psychotic, unquote, I refused to take more meds. The mission is not yet complete. Immediately after the appointment with Kaplan, I went to see Dr. Martyr, a schizophrenia expert who was following me for a movement disorder caused by the meds called tardive dyskinesia, or TD. He'd never seen me ill before and had been under the impression, and I hadn't disabused him of it, that I had a mild psychotic illness and that my primary concern was avoiding or minimizing TD. Once in his office, I sat on his couch, folded over, and began muttering. I was disheveled. I couldn't remember when I'd ate or what I'd eaten. When had I bathed? In Oxford? Before Oxford? Did it matter if we were going to all die anyway? Anyone who walked into that room that day would have thought Martyr was treating a schizophrenic street person. A week later, people told me that's exactly what I looked like. Head explosions and people trying to kill. Is it okay if I totally trash your office? You need to leave if you think you're going to do that, said Martyr. Okay, small, fire on ice. Tell them not to kill me. Tell them not to kill me. What have I done wrong? All the explosions, hundreds of thousands with thoughts, interdiction. Elyn, do you feel you're dangerous to other people or to yourself, he asked. That's a trick question. I said, I don't think you ask a mental health law professor if she meets the criteria for commitment in the language of the statutes. I'm not sure how you do it, but not that way. No, it's not a trick question, he said. I'm serious. I think you need to be in the hospital. I could get you into UCLA right now and the whole thing could be very discreet. Ha, ha, ha. You're offering to put me in the hospital? Hospitals, they're bad, they're mad, they're sad. One must stay away. I'm God, or I used to be. I give life and I take it away. Forgive me, for I know not what I do. I really think a hospital would be a good idea, Martyr said. No, thank you oh so very much, I said. All right then, but if I were you, I'd stay away from work for a while. You don't want your colleagues to see this. Thanks, banks, bang, bye. See you soon. Oblivious to the look on his face, I left. The next morning, I did drag myself to my office, my hideout and my refuge. I ran into my colleague Ed in the hall, and he quickly figured out what was happening. Elyn, what the hell's going on? I thought you were kidding at first, but you're not, are you? Does anyone else know about this? Is it okay for anyone else to know? I wouldn't mind telling Michael, I said, not the archangel one, our colleague. Ending the passage. Suffice to say that Ed eventually brought me home, showing the good judgment to follow my psychiatrist's advice rather than tackle me to the ground and take me to the ER, as others, including Ed's internist wife, were recommending. Eventually, I acceded to everybody's demand to take more medication. I could no longer deny the truth, and I could not change it. The wall that kept me, Elyn, Professor Sachs, separate from the insane woman I had once seen in that mirror long ago, lay smashed and in ruins. And then another event pushed me past the point of no return in accepting that I indeed had a mental illness. I got on a new drug, reading from the text. Because of the risks of my meds, Kaplan suggested one of the new classes of an antipsychotic, a drug called Zyprexa. Parenthetically, I was on like double the maximum dose and still having a lot of breakthrough symptoms, so I switched to clozapine, which is not perfect, but it's really been a miracle drug. Anyway, with the olanzapine, the change was fast and dramatic. First, the side effects were much less than with the Novain. More important, the clinical result was, not to overstate it, like daylight dawning after a long night. I could see the world in a way I'd never seen it before. The illness was still there, but it wasn't pushing me around as much as it once did. Finally, I could focus on the task at hand, unencumbered by the threat of lurking demons. The most profound effect of the new drug was to convince me, once and for all, that I actually had a real illness. For 20 years, as I said, I'd struggled with that acceptance, managing to hold on to the belief that basically there was nothing unusual about my thoughts. Everyone's mind contained the chaos that mine did. It's just that they were all much better at managing it than I was. My problem, I thought, had less to do with my mind than it had to do with my lack of social graces. I wasn't mentally ill. I was socially maladroit. Of course, that wasn't true. There's no way to overstate what a thunderclap this revelation was to me. And with it, my final and most profound resistance to the idea that I was mentally ill began to give way. Ironically, the more I accepted I had a mental illness, the less the illness defined me. It became accident and not essence, at which point the riptide that had kept sucking me in set me free, ending the passage. I was finally able to integrate these three aspects of myself. I was indeed Elyn, the professor, and the lady of the medical charts. It was making my peace with the lady of the medical charts, my mental illness, that allowed Elyn and the professor to flourish and enjoy the many wonderful relationships that have blessed my life. As fortunate and blessed as my life has been, I don't want to leave you with the impression that everything is smooth sailing. Not too long ago, my medications became unbalanced and I was involved in a traffic accident. Fortunately, no one was hurt, but I was arrested and handcuffed, put in the back of a police car, and spent several hours handcuffed in the police station. It was a painful, humiliating, inconvenient, and expensive incident that brought back many bad memories. When you've been restrained, being handcuffed is especially toxic. I had the resources in my life to take care of what happened. Many people with mental illness do not. Could all of you here who are advocates for people with mental illness please raise your hands? Wow, fantastic. When people like you take care of people like me who may not have the resources, it's really important. On behalf of others with psychiatric illness, thank you from the bottom of my heart. So I'm deeply grateful also to the organizers of this conference, to those who are speaking, and to you who are attending. It's true that voices from different branches of the government are speaking with clinicians. And it is essential that those of us with lived experience have a voice in every part of the conversation. We are your sisters, your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your colleagues, and your friends. We want, in the words of Sigmund Freud, what everyone wants, to work and to love. Thank you for helping us work and love. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Beckie, do we have time for questions? You have time for questions? So I was taught in analytic school that if you just sit here or stand here quietly, someone's going to speak. Okay. There we go. We got to.
Elyn, would you repeat the question because we won't.
Right.
Hi, my name's Rachel Post. Thank you so much for sharing your beautiful story. I work for an organization that historically identifies as serving people with substance use disorders. We now also provide community mental health services. One thing that's been interesting to me as somebody who started off in the community mental health field, but then moved into an organization that started providing substance use disorder services, is the difference in the role of peers, at least from my organization, where nearly half of our workforce are people who have lived experience, from people who are not only on the front lines, but from directors of million-dollar programs. And so it's interesting to just see, for me, the disconnect, like how much we value people with lived experience in the profession of services for substance use disorders compared to the disparity in the role of people with lived mental health experiences in community mental health. And I'm wondering if you have any advice to community mental health providers or administrators about how to do better by incorporating people with lived experience into those kinds of positions.
Okay. Thank you very much. So the question is, in substance abuse circles and mental health circles, there's a lot of emphasis with substance abuse in people in recovery providing services, and that's just not the case with mental health disorders. And then the question is advice is how to better involve people with mental health disorders. And I'm not really sure kind of historically what the etiology of that difference is. It may be because the general public understands more and stigmatizes less substance abuse, and that they stigmatize more and maybe are more afraid of people with mental health disorders. I do think there's been kind of a movement to involve us in this arena, so we have peer networks and so on. I think those are really terrific. I've also had cancer. Nobody understands the experience of cancer or the experience of mental illness as much as someone who him or herself suffers from those illnesses. So it can provide an opportunity to speak with someone who understands firsthand. You might trust them more, you might feel more identified with them, and all those kinds of things. And maybe what you do is, your county department of mental health sets up a division that's a consumer advocate division where peers are employed and are part of the the manner of approaching other people with lived experience. But it is a good question, and it's sort of kind of telling that there is this difference. Thank you.
And I thank you too, Elyn.
Thanks.
And my question concerns metabolic syndrome.
Sorry, where are you?
Where am I?
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Okay. Okay.
I'm right here. My question concerns metabolic syndrome. So many have become obese.
Right.
Do you have a secret? How have you avoided that?
It's a good question. The stats, so say on clozapine and Zyprexa both make you gain a whole lot of weight. I think, 50% or even 80% gain 25 pounds and 25% gain 60 pounds. I'm sort of making up these numbers, but it's a big incidence of people who develop that. And then obviously that increases the risk of metabolic syndrome. I just may be one of the lucky ones. I will say that I used to be really lucky in that I was one of the people who, if I just ate until I was full, I wouldn't gain weight. And when I got on the drugs, if I started eating until I was full, I would gain weight. So for the first 2 weeks I was on Zyprexa, I gained 12 pounds, in 2 weeks, which was really horrifying. But then I started seeing a nutritionist and just being very attentive to what I was eating and that kind of thing. And I eat everything. I eat chocolate and I eat ice cream, and as well as cheese and omelets and stuff like that. But I try to eat in moderation and so on. So. Also, I'm not sure what percentage of people with mental health disorders, how much more obese they are than the general public. Because isn't it true that like 60% of the public is obese?
Elyn, I wanted to comment on something you said. You said that Freud said that part of his point was that in individuals that present psychosis did not form strong therapeutic relationships, and I know that to be wrong.
Right.
I practiced psychiatry in the past, not here in Oregon, but in Brazil, and had many patients that were psychotic and had, in fact, just the opposite, the most intense transference that and I'm trained in psychoanalysis.
I totally agree with that.
In Brazil as well. But my point, my question back to you is, so how do you see the combination of factors that actually helped you recover? What was the combination that really the secret sauce that helped you enter recovery? I think you spoke a little bit about it, but I think it's a very important point that you made about the relationship.
Yes,
And so I would love to just highlight that.
Okay. So one of the points was about, can psychotic patients form transferences? And this doctor says that she certainly has had the experience with her patients that they do. They may be psychotic transfers. I kid around that I went from thinking that my analysts were monsters and trying to kill me to thinking that they just didn't like me. So I went from kind of a psychotic transference to a neurotic transference. And then the other question is what combination of facts were helpful in my recovery? I'm going to say two things: the combination of facts in different arenas, and then focus on the psychoanalytic relationship. So I think there were three things that helped with recovery. One, excellent treatment, both excellent psychopharmacology and excellent analysis. I know the theory analysis is supposed to end, but I'm a lifer because I don't want to risk, as I think I said in my talk. But the meds have helped too, and I struggled a lot around the need to take meds, and we can talk about that. I have a bunch of ideas why people do. So treatment, wonderfully supportive and caring friends and family who both gave a richness and depth to my life and served as another set of eyes when I started going downhill. Actually, Steve once called my analyst and said, Elyn tells me you're going to China, and she says she's going to go there in advance of your trip and wipe it out of all the bad people, to which he said, oh, how very considerate of her. And then the third thing is really accommodating and intellectually stimulating workplace. For me, when I'm writing an argument or a counter argument, the psychotic stuff recedes to the sidelines. And I like to say my mind is both my best friend and my worst enemy. So should I also talk about how therapy helps? So I think it does a bunch of things, and these are not all specific to psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic therapy, but there are some of the things that have contributed, I think, to recovery, to my recovery. And the first is that stress is bad for any illness, and particularly psychiatric illness. And the analysis can help you understand and either cope with or avoid stressors. Second, it fortifies an observing ego, sort of where you kind of stand back and survey what's going on in your mind and try to make sense of it or reject it if it seems crazy or whatever. Third, it's a safe place to bring your scary and violent thoughts. Sort of acts as a kind of steam valve. If you say it in the therapy, you don't have to say it in your outside world, which is a really good thing. Then it offers insight, which can sometimes be helpful. So I think some people think that psychotic symptoms are random firings of neurons that have no meaning. I don't think any analyst would think that, but some people also think that they do have a meaning, that they tell the truth about your psychic reality, but that it doesn't help the patient to interpret because the patient can't hear it. And then the third view is it has a meaning, and interpreting can at times really be helpful, and that really was my experience. So once I was saying violent things, and my doctor said, Elyn, I think you're saying these violent things because you're really scared. The violence is your defense against fear, and that made a lot of sense to me. Also, it's very empowering to someone who accepts you not only for the good, but also for the bad and ugly, as I said with Mrs. Jones. Another way to think of this is that people today don't speak so much about reduction and remission of symptoms, but about quality of life. And importantly, it's for the person, her or himself, to say what that is for them. But I think therapy can help.
And I don't know what all of us do about that, but it is really a sad commentary on the way we deal with mental illness in this country.
Thank you. It's a really important point. One of the years of my institute programming was on, quote, criminalization of mental illness. And it's a scandal and a tragedy that people with LA County Jail and Cook County Prison are kind of the biggest psych facilities in the country. That's a scandal and a horror. It's really awful. And what can we do about that? Well, one thing I think is, the advent of mental health courts. So we have domestic violence courts and veterans courts and substance abuse courts, and certain places are now starting to establish mental health courts. And you opt into it. You don't get forced into it. So the defendant and the person will be, quote, sentenced to treatment instead of jail or prison. And if they successfully do what they're supposed to do in the community, they can have their criminal record expunged. Jail and prison are no place for someone with mental health disorders. A student of mine did a documentary about, turned out she was Marlon Brando's daughter. I didn't even know that, but she did a documentary about people, on Skid Row who have mental illness. And one of the guys was like, well, I get picked up very frequently and get taken in for trespassing and disturbing the peace and vagrancy, all those kinds of status offenses. And I'm in jail, and the jailer says, get in line. And I get in line, but then the voices tell me to go over there. So I go over there and I get beat up and have an infraction marked against me. And there's a lot of evidence that people with the same conviction and the same sentence spend longer time in jail or prison if they have a mental health disorder than if they don't. So this is something we need to really try to address. And I'm gratified that more places are doing that, and I hope more and more do it. I don't know, do you have a mental health court here?
Well, I'm in federal court.
Oh, you're in federal court. Yeah.
But the bigger problem is, there are actually clients of mine who, for the first time, have gotten help on supervision.
Right.
But supervision ends, and we're all happy they're successfully complete, but then they're out in the real world with no help.
Yeah, no, that's an incredibly important point, that we ought to provide services to help people re-enter. How on earth are people going to do okay if you just kind of cut them loose without help? I totally agree with that.
Hello, my name is Kelsey. Abiding by the Supreme Court ruling of Onset Act for certain commitment types, how influential do you feel in least restrictive environment is, and how key do you feel it is to recovery for persons with mental health issues?
So is the least restrictive alternative sort of doctrine helpful to people in recovery? I think so. I think the principle of least restrictive alternative should be applied to everything. If you can take fewer rights away and still achieve the same purpose, then why wouldn't we do that? And I think it also sends the message to consumers, to people with lived experience and people in recovery, that we value their liberty as much as we value anybody else's liberty, and we're going to try as best we can to infringe on it as little as we can. So, sure, thanks.
Thank you, Elyn.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.